Hello, it's Mr. Duker and back again, and today looking at the road to Civil War, right? So, Civil War is complicated. It's wars don't happen by accident, right? Civil wars especially, and so there's a long series of think of like dominoes, event after event after event, that eventually, once all these dominoes fall, you have civil war, right? But it's a long, super complicated process. And so in order to super simplify this, I thought it'd be great to kind of go over each event just quickly, kind of in order, so you can kind of see the progression we head towards civil war in the United States. It's a lot. Probably end up doing this in two parts because it's so much. We're going to get started here and see how we end up with civil war. It's a complicated process. So you got to understand, as the United States is always growing, right? The United States is always growing west. Even once the first colonies were founded, people were already moving into the back country, moving out west. And as the country was moving west, it was slowly splitting into two parts, north and south. This is what we call sectionalism, right? And so what this is each part was kind of becoming its own nation. Each part was developing its own identity, very different from the other. And at this time, people felt more loyal to their state than to their nation, right? Or you could say here in the slide, people, if you asked them where you're from, they might say, I'm a New Yorker first, and you're an American as a distant second, right? People were very loyal to their home states, and there was this divide that was fracturing the nation into two parts, of course, north and south, divided on many issues. Slavery is the big one, but there are other things too that was slowly kind of, again, splitting the country. That's called sectionalism. Now, if we look at the North, right, in general, the North, we remember it as being mostly, or at this time, changing into a mostly industrial area. More people are moving into urban areas. You see the rise of factories now. They're more into manufacturing and making things. You have a large immigrant population that would mostly move to and live in the North to work in these factories. The North is connected by railroads, so it's easier to travel. This will accelerate during the Civil War and afterwards, but they're laying down railroad track, and so they're more connected. It's easier to travel. Largely industrial, very wealthy, and the North mostly believes in the abolition of slavery, getting rid of slavery, right? So that's the North in a nutshell, and how history textbooks like to view them. The South is the opposite end of that spectrum, right? The South was still largely agricultural, right? A lot of people still lived or worked on or were near plantations. Not everyone owned a plantation. That was like the elite and the wealthy. But that was a big part of the Southern economy, because these plantations were growing a lot of crops. At this time, mostly cotton, but other plants as well. But it was agricultural, rural, small little towns is what the South was built on. Very few large cities. And these southern states were very much independent of one another. They had a little bit of railroad track, but most travel was done by river or kind of still walking. So these southern states are kind of secluded even from one another. And Southern society, of course, is built around slavery. There was this whole working class of owned property people that worked not on just plantations, but worked in the cities. Slaves had skills. Some of them had trades. It wasn't just everyone's working on the cotton plantation. It wasn't as simple as that, but having this large slave working class is what their society was based off of. They did all of the tedious manual labor, and their society was built around having slaves. Now, slavery is, of course, there's many issues that start Civil War, but slavery is the wedge that really drove the two sides apart. By 1860, there were about 3 million slaves in the United States, or if you think of it this way, about 1 in 7 Americans was owned by somebody else. Very depressing. Slavery had been around from the very beginning. The very first colonists brought slaves with them. And slavery was around, but what really accelerates it is the invention of the cotton gin by a guy named Eli Whitney, right? So cotton is not always the cash crop. It wasn't always grown very much in the South. Cotton existed, but it is a tedious and hard crop to grow and make money off of. For example, if you've ever seen a cotton ball before, it's very dirty. There's a lot of seeds inside of it and dry leaves and stuff. And if you're going to use cotton, you have to clean that. So it used to be people had to pick all those things out by hand. It takes a long time. But with the cotton gin, you would just put a bunch of dirty cotton into this box, turn the crank. Later they were mechanical. And these needles just kind of go in and pick and pull that cotton apart. All the dirty stuff falls to the bottom, and you're left with clean, usable cotton afterwards. So very quickly, in one day, you could like clean as much cotton as you used to maybe do in like a week. So because cotton was easy to clean out, it became profitable. It took a lot of work to grow cotton, and so this really increased the demand for slaves to work on the cotton plantations because it's not an easy crop to grow. And you needed people to clean, to harvest it, to plant. It's labor intensive, right? But like I said, other slaves worked as, like blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors, worked in the home as maids and cooks and babysitters. They were everywhere, not just on the cotton plantations. Though we like to simplify and think that they are. Now, what was life like as a slave? Not good, terrible, right? Slaves were property. It's a different mindset. But as property, just like, your coffee mug, your car, your phone, you could treat it however you want, right? They had no rights. And so slaves were beaten, slaves were abused, slaves were held down and sometimes tortured and killed, and that was fine. If I take this mug and throw it on the ground and break it, I'm out of coffee mug, but, it's my mug. I can do whatever I want with it. And that was kind of the mentality they had with slaves. Slaves were sold at auction. So, your kids could be sold off. Marriage, your partner could be married away and there's nothing you can do about it. It was an awful existence for these slaves, and they would try and fight back as best they can. They had formed very tight-knit communities. Some of them were able to learn how to like sabotage equipment or like slow down their owners' plantations and stuff like that, so they wouldn't get caught but not get in trouble. Education was a dangerous thing, and so they would sometimes in secret teach each other how to read and write. But if you got caught educating yourself, you could get in big trouble. And of course, trying to run away if you were able to. So there's a picture there of a guy in an iron collar. That's a real thing they would do. If you were a slave who ran away often, as punishment, they would put these big iron bars on you. You'd have to carry that around all day. It makes your work a lot more harder to carry that around. You're not going to be able to run away easily with these giant bars. You're not going to be able to hide and run fast. So it was a punishment. It was a warning. Happened often. Slaves were beat. Owners used to pride themselves on being able to beat a slave in the inch of their life, but not kill them. It was not a good situation. As you can see right there, that's a slave who was whipped with a bullwhip. And it leaves these, it tears your back apart, these really gnarly looking scars. And during auction, they would have the slaves go up, just like, like a car auction or something. People would go and they would poke and prod and look around them. And slaves with a lot of scars like this would be worth less because that shows that this guy was a troublemaker, right? I don't know if he talked back. I don't know if he ran away. But he is punished. He's got some wear and tear on him, so he would be worth a little less. Slaves with little scarring would be worth more because they either listened well or knew how to play this game and not get in trouble. So they were treated just like animals, which is awful, but that's the way it was. If slaves ran away, they would put rewards up for them. And slave hunting was a thing. People would track down these runaway slaves, and you could bring them back to the owners for a reward. Because again, they were considered property. And, you know, if you have like a pet that runs away, you put flyers up around town to try and, if anyone's seen them, bring them back. It's awful, but that's the same way slaves were treated as well at this time. Now, there's another territory or section that's called, the West, or Western territories. As the country's moving west, the West is changing and adding to this sectionalism, right? The country expands rapidly in the 1800s, which should be a good thing, but as the country's expanding, there's a big question that comes up often. These new territories, when they apply for statehood, are they going to be free or slave states, right? Are they going to have legalized slavery, or are they going to abolish it? And that was kind of the main question at the time, because, well, the country was balanced in the legislative branch. What I mean is, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, it was mostly balanced. So you had equal number of slave and free states, which meant the status quo was safe and no one side had more power over the other. But as these new states start to join the country, they could upset that balance, and that could really make things kind of messy. And so when states entered, it was always a tedious time, because that question of being free or slave could give one side more power than the other, and then they would have an advantage, and then they would start to rule the country. And so it was really a divisive issue. Even adding new states was not always a good thing. Case in point, Missouri, right? So way back in 1820, Missouri was ready to join the Union, and it wanted to be a slave state. People in the North did not like this, because that would upset this balance and give majority rules to the Southern slave states. So the North was trying to block this, and the South was trying to push it through. We want to grow the country, but we don't want one side to be more powerful than the other. And this was a real issue until it got solved with what we call the Missouri Compromise, right? And this is it's important, because this lays the groundwork in the future for all other states to join the nation, right? So here's the deal that they came up with. Missouri will join the Union as a slave state, but we will also add Maine at the same time as a free state. So it keeps that balance equal. So no side will be more powerful. And then we will also draw a line across the southern border of Missouri. So this is the 36-30 latitude line, like on the map. If you look at a map, you got all those invisible lines, latitude, longitude. It's just the bottom of Missouri's border. They take it all the way west to California. Basically, this line becomes the Missouri Compromise line. From now on, any state that joins the Union above the line is going to be free, no slavery state. Every state below will enter as a slave state. So we don't have to worry about this every time a new state wants to enter. And we're going to try and let them in 2 at a time to try and keep that balance. 1 free, 1 slave, 1 free, 1 slave. And that, for the time, seems to solve the issue, the Missouri Compromise. Here's a map you can see. The red are the northern abolition states. The green are the southern slave states. The country still has a lot of growing to do, as you can see. But you can see that red line there, the bottom of Missouri. Take it all the way across in the future, and everything is going to be slave below and free above, is the idea. Then California comes around, right? California gold's discovered in 1848, not 1849. And quickly you got tons of people moving out west to try and stake their claim and strike it rich in the gold rush. And just like that, California is ready to apply for statehood. They have enough people now. They kind of jump over all those middle territories, and they're ready to join the Union. But again, this causes a problem because California is on both sides of the compromise line, and California wants to be free, but part of it is below in the slave area. So what are we going to do? This creates another problem, and it threatens the Missouri Compromise. It throws it into jeopardy. California messing everything up. So we get a new compromise, the Compromise of 1850, right? This is a 5-part plan to try and settle this California issue. It's a little complicated, but the 5 parts are as follows, right? Number 1, California is going to join as a free state, so California gets what it wants. No slavery, free state, good. 2, we're going to create what's called the Fugitive Slave Act. So you got a lot of those runaway slaves were running away to safety in the north. The South is a little salty about this. Hey, my property is up in the north, and you Northerners are not doing anything to give me my property back. So the Fugitive Slave Act required if you were a runaway slave and someone finds you in the north, they had to return you back to the South. That was the idea. The slave trade will be banned in Washington, D.C. It used to be you could buy and sell slaves in Washington, no more in the nation's capital. I'm going to jump to number 5 here. We're going to create new territories out of land that we had gained previously in the Mexican-American War. So New Mexico was one giant territory, and we're going to cut it into pieces to get some more kind of states out of that. So New Mexico and Utah, our territories are created. And Texas, which has joined the country now, has a lot of debt from its little revolution and mini war of Mexico. And so to kind of throw the South a bone, or to help Texas out, the United States promises we will pick up the Texas's debt. So that's good for Texas, and Texas likes this deal. The South will follow through on it. So the South gets a little bit of what they want. They get some more states in the South. Texas gets rid of its debt, and they get the Fugitive Slave Act, so their slaves come back. California comes in as free, but there will be no more slave trading in Washington. So that works for a while. So here's our new map now showing how the country has grown in the 30 years since the Missouri Compromise. You can see we've added some more states. We've taken that territory from Mexico. And California is right in the middle of that Missouri Compromise line, but we'll squeak them in as a free state. A couple of years later, you get a very important book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? There's a few important books in American history, like really important books in American history. This is definitely one of them. So it's written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's an abolitionist, and her idea was she wanted to write a book detailing the true story and the real horrors behind slavery, and that's what the book is about. Before this time, if you ask somebody from the South, what was slavery like? There's a lot of kind of mystery or fake news and misinformation. The South loved to tell anyone who would listen, oh, hey, we treat our slaves fine, and they're happy, and they're well taken care of, and they got a good deal. They got a roof, and they got a job, and they got food and clothes, and it's a good life, and they're happy and complacent with being slaves in the South, right? It's all BS, and the book really exposes just the graphic horrors and the dehumanization that happened to these slaves being beaten and tortured and breaking up of families. It really just kind of exposes the truth about slavery. It was a huge bestseller. This is before internet and YouTube, so people read books back then, and everybody read about this book, or everybody knew about this book, and it really kind of stokes the anger and the fire of abolitionists in the North, kind of as a wake-up call. Like, the South has been lying to us. This is horrible what's going on, and we can't let this happen anymore. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin really kind of raises awareness about the evils of slavery, and just, we need to stop this from happening, because it's not as peachy as the South would like to say. Next, we get the KansasNebraska Act. And so, again, it's a new state coming in and threatening the stability the balance we've been trying to create here in the United States. So, Kansas wants to come in as a slave state, but it's above the northern Missouri Compromise line. So, that's a problem. What are we going to do? A guy named Stephen Douglas, he's a senator from Illinois, and we'll hear about him a lot more going forward, has an idea. Well, wait a minute. What if, bear with me here, what if we just let the people in Kansas vote on if they want to have slavery or not, right? The United States, we're a democracy. There's nothing wrong with voting. So with popular sovereignty, let's let the people decide the issue instead of people in Washington doing it. And so this act is passed, which basically lets them vote. However, what seems like a good idea quickly backfires. As soon as it's left up to a vote, what we see is quickly people from both sides, North and South, pack their bags. We're moving to Kansas, not because we want to live there, but because we want to participate in this vote, and we kind of want to swing it our way. So Northerners come to vote for abolition. Southerners flood into Kansas to vote for slavery, and tensions are high. I mean, if you're moving, you got a lot invested in this, right? I mean, you're obviously, you're pretty passionate, and they will do anything to try and get their way. And we get what's called, oh, there you go. Kansas territory is above the line. That threatens the previous compromises we have here. And basically the Missouri Compromise is getting shredded with this, which is not acceptable. So we get what's called bleeding Kansas, right? By any means necessary means violence. And so we will actually have kind of like a mini civil war as people from both sides begin to intimidate and even attack each other to try and get them to not vote or to try and stay away from the polls. So we have, like I said, a mini war. I think in one case, one group even pulled out some cannons to attack the other side with. It's small, but this goes to show just how a big deal this was, how passionate people were, and that now we're going to go and start killing each other over the slavery issue. Now, the one person we remember the most from this time is a guy named John Brown. There's a picture of him right there. So John Brown's a Northern abolitionist, very passionate about freeing slaves. And not only does he talk the walk, he walks the walk. And so he participates in what is called the, I think, Potawatomi Massacre, where he goes and captures a couple pro-slavery residents with his sons and some other people, and brutally kills and murders them, hacks them to pieces with swords. He's not the only person who killed people, but he gets a lot of publicity for just the audacity here of what he's doing. And kind of a hero in the North, a villain in the South, but again, illustrates the lengths that the country is willing to go to now over the slavery issue. John Brown escapes. He'll come back, but he's not done yet. Going forward, we have a very famous election, the Lincoln-Douglas election. So in 1854, you have the Republican Party is formed during this time. The Republican Party is an anti-slavery party. It was formed for one reason, for abolition, to get rid of slavery. So it's kind of the new kid on the block. You got a lot of politicians joining this party. Abraham Lincoln was one of the first people to join the Republican Party. And he ends up challenging that Stephen Douglas guy from Kansas, Nebraska, for the Senate seat in Illinois. Now, this is famous not only because it's Abraham Lincoln, but these two men would engage in a series of debates, very popular, 7 debates where they would, just like a modern debate. Actually, I think this is the first time you actually had 2 politicians that would participate like on stage, side by side, answering questions, talking, engaging with each other during a political election. A lot of times before, people would just debate over newspapers, or someone would ask them, it was kind of fragmented, the way politicians used to go back and forth. But here, it's like the first modern debate. And we still do this today in the same style that Lincoln and Douglas pioneered during this time. But during these 7 debates, the 2 men go back and forth, and their debate becomes front page reading material, right? Lincoln is expressing the kind of anti-slavery side of the United States, articulating their positions and their views. Stephen Douglas is more of the pro-slavery side, and so depending on where you lived, you would wake up every morning, read the newspaper, and either agree or disagree with these guys, but they really kind of crystallized the country's views on slavery. Lincoln loses this election, but kind of becomes not a celebrity, but becomes very famous because everyone reads about this young guy from Illinois and his eloquent views on the slavery issue, and he becomes a very well-known public figure because of these, right? He'll come back also in not too long. Moving forward, there's a lot of things, like I said. We have what's called the Dred Scott court case, very important court case as well on the eve of the Civil War. So a little complicated, but big ramifications. So again, very simply, Dred Scott is a slave who with his owner goes to visit the North. While they're up there, Scott's owner croaks and dies. And Scott says, all right, I'm on free soil, and since my owner is no longer around, that makes me a free individual. I have my freedom because he happened to die in the North where slavery is illegal. Scott's owner's children disagree and basically claim that Dred Scott is part of their inheritance because he's property, and they sue to have him returned to them because he has value and he's part of their father's estate. This court case goes all the way to Supreme Court, where they make a infamous ruling against Dred Scott. Excuse me. Famously, I guess you could say, a guy named Roger B. Taney, he's like the head of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, goes out and rules against Scott. Basically, Dred Scott needs to be returned. Dred Scott is property and should be returned to the children. He was not made free just because the owner died in the North, but goes a step further and says that Dred Scott or any other slave, this court case never should have happened in the first place because Dred Scott is property and he has no rights that anybody should respect. It's ridiculous that this happened because your property can't sue, right? Your coffee mug, your car, your toaster can't sue you to try and get its freedom, and that's no different than what Dred Scott's trying to do. This case never should have made it to the court. He's not talking about Scott here. He's talking about all slaves and ex-slaves in the United States. Basically, what the court says, if you're African American in the United States, it does not matter where you live. It does not matter what status you think you have. You have no rights whatsoever that the government is going to respect. It basically makes every African American property again and infuriates people in the North. But in the South, this is kind of claimed as a victory. But again, it's stoking the anger. It's making people very upset. And this is just fuel on the fire on the eve of the Civil War. John Brown, it's a lot. And comes back. And like I said, John Brown is the guy who's going to walk the walk and talk the talk. So very passionate about freeing slaves. He was part of that bleeding Kansas mini Civil War, but he has grander plans. And so he aims to start a slave revolution. He believes he's actually like on a mission from God is what he's doing here. But with his sons, he makes a new plan to take things a step further. And so he he raids an armory in a little town called Harper's Ferry in Virginia. So in the middle of the night, him and his sons go in there, they break into this armory and steal all the guns and the weapons. And his plan is to arm the slaves for a revolution so they can go and kill their owners. And then he's going to go march through the South, arming and freeing slaves, and these slaves are going to start a slave revolution and overthrow their masters. That is his idea. Doesn't happen. The plan falls apart. He ends up being captured in a barn. His plan is found out. He's surrounded. I think his sons are all killed trying to escape. John Brown is captured alive, quickly put on trial and sentenced to hang as a traitor. So he ends up, well, dying from the hangman's noose. Very, very important, though. Because again, this kind of really stokes the anger in the country and shows just how far people are willing to go to fight now for this slavery issue. In the North, very much a hero, right? John Brown, as Frederick Douglass is in that great quote down there, right? He is willing to die for slavery. Not many people are yet. And so he's a huge hero in the North, putting his life on the line, sacrificing his family. Yes, to kill people, but to do something righteous and free the slaves. In the South, he becomes the boogeyman, right? Here is a northerner who's invading our towns. He's going to arm our slaves to kill us in the middle of the night, right? He is something to be feared, and he scares the hell out of Southerners. After John Brown, the Southern states it's a wake-up call for them. They're afraid there might be more Northern attacks. And so they get a head start and they begin to arm and train militia, part-time soldiers. So if war ever happens from the North, they will be ready to defend themselves. So the South is kind of getting a head start on the Civil War because John Brown puts the fear of, God, living daylights, whatever it is, he scares the hell out of them. And so they start to prepare for Civil War. What finally kind of, I guess the last domino you could say ends up being the election, right? If people, what started the Civil War, it's not slavery. It's really a presidential election, right? So an election? 1860 comes around and we have the presidential election that year because of all the heightened tensions and events surrounding slavery. The number one issue of the day here is slavery and what are we going to do about it as a nation. Abraham Lincoln comes back to run for president as the Republican Party. Everybody knows where Lincoln stands on slavery from the previous LincolnDouglas debates. Like I said, he's very, very popular in the North. And so Lincoln will run and win this election. But there's 4 people who run in this election. And if you look on that very bottom there, it's kind of a rematch. Stephen Douglas, who beat him in the Senate, is also going to run for the Democratic Party. There's 2 other guys there as well. It's a weird election because Lincoln wins, but it's a little messy, right? No Southern state votes for Abraham Lincoln. So half the country is not voting for him, yet he becomes their president, right? And for the South, this is the last straw. This election kind of proves to them that it's just a matter of time now before Lincoln in the North come and take away their slaves. I didn't vote for this guy. Nobody I know voted for this guy. This guy doesn't have our best interest in mind. This government no longer represents us. And so very quickly after the election, you start to see Southern state after Southern state start to secede, which means to leave, and they start to form their own country, which is called the Confederate States of America, which is something they thought they had every right to do, and they're leaving. No slave has been taken away. Slavery is not the thing yet. It will be maybe later, they're afraid, but they're leaving. Why are they leaving? They're leaving because they're upset, angry, and afraid of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is what actually forms the Confederacy. And that's it. After that, we're going to have war here pretty soon. I guess that wasn't as long as I thought, though it was still pretty long. So I guess no 2-part video. But again, that's just a very comprehensive, very quick, hopefully super simplified, though there's a lot of stuff going on here, view of events leading up to the Civil War. Like I said, there's a lot more things I could go into, and there's a lot of things I left out. But those are the big points that will show up in textbooks and in your history classes. And so hopefully you can just kind of see the order that things progressed in and how we're constantly escalating and getting closer and closer to the danger zone of civil war. So that's all for today. That's Mr. Duker, Super Simplified Social Studies, and I hope that helped you out in your learning. All right, I'll catch you later.